We've only got an hour. We've been doing these classes for an hour, and we're gonna stick with that. So we got a lot of stuff to cover today. Just to kind of break the ice, Kaylin, do I just tell you when I need a screen switched? Or, okay. So here's the disclosure to start this meeting. There's so many different scenarios you can run into with all of our forms and our contracts. The first thing we want to do is remember that we're not attorneys. And the beautiful thing about our forms systems that we have is they're continually adding forms and choices and options so often that I have no idea what's on there until somebody calls me and talks about it, and we actually get on there and look, and you guys discover something that nobody else has seen before. And so they're adding forms yearly, if not more than yearly, I think, and then they're also revising the forms as they need them.
Yes, can you hear me?
Can hear you, Kyle.
So
Come across the cove at 565.
I muted him. Sorry.
What's that? Okay, sorry. Wasn't sure what was going on there. So we're going to try to cover some of the new forms. We're also going to cover some of the revisions, and then try to make this so that we're not going to go line by line. But what you guys don't know, or what most of you do know, is there's so many different situations that come up. Lots of times I phone a friend, and one of my phone a friend experts is on here to help us today, and that's Ebbie. And then Ebbie is going to help us go through all the forms, because there's not only are the forms changing, but the way that we use the forms in a given contract changes the way it's negotiated and the way it's written as well. So we have a lot of brainstorming behind the scenes about the different things that come up. We also have our contracts Nazi, Amanda, on here. I'm sorry. She keeps us safe, and anybody who knows Amanda knows that's the furthest thing from the truth. She is very good at making sure that we stay compliant. We're fresh off a audit. I feel like we're fresh off it. It's probably been more than a year now, but we didn't have one for, Ebbie, wasn't it like 20 years?
Exactly. The one that they did was but they did the whole area on the lead-based paint disclosure, if you remember that.
I do, yeah.
Okay. That was a blanket of auditing from every office in the lake. So other than that, no, it had been about 20 years. Long
time. And it was like a worrisome, like any kind of audit you go through. It was a little bit scary, but it was such a great learning experience to go through that. And we also learned there's a couple, there's a difference between what is required and what is best practice. And we want to do all of the above. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. In order to make these things possible, we're going to do these quarterly, and in order to make them into an hour, we broke them up into segments. And so this one is kind of on a sales side, and we'll go through the standard sales contract, or the buyer's agency, and then the sales contract, and then some of the new forms that are part of a normal contract that you might see. Anything before we get started, anything that you want to add, Ebbie?
Yeah, I do. Of course I do, Jeff. It's, I've always got to have my 2 cents in there. I wanted to explain, how you said about the changes in the MAR forms. The Forms Committee is one of the few committees on the board that do meet even without being the regular meetings that we do on a state level, because then the committee gets together and they say, okay, what other things are happening during the year that can't wait till the quarterly meeting? But I also was going to say, years ago, they only changed it once a year because it was costing us about $10,000 for every change the board had to pay. So that's when they went on, they paid to get the online forms so that we could change it in a matter of minutes, okay? But the reason you see so many red line changes recently, I say recently, the last 2 years, and I know this is off the subject, but I think it's worth mentioning. You had Kansas City and St. Louis that were using their own forms instead of MAR forms, okay? So we would have all these meetings and we'd sit and say, okay, what is the most, give us the top important things that are on your contract that are not on MAR. So to try to get them to use the same form as us, we've added things, just like, for example, the solar panel, you know, we added that. That's not something that's typical here, but it was in other areas. So we went through trying to appease everybody. So if you're wondering why you see so many changes, that's why. We're trying to get everybody, Kansas City, St. Louis, and the Lake, to all use the MAR forms. Okay?
Yeah, that's good. There's lots of variables. I never realized that until I got on this side of things, how often they do that.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump in. Let's talk about a couple of the new things that were added, new forms that were added this year. Not going to be really new to many of you, but they did add their own wire fraud advisory. You know, we had one of those for I don't know how long, the last 3 years maybe. That became a very prevalent scam and a terrible one, and it got really close to touching us in one of our deals. We had a couple close calls, but we had one that was very close. So it became it became prevalent all over, and they added their own form. So when they did this and when we figured it out, we just said, you know, use our form or use the wire fraud advisory that's on the forms. We don't care. Just use one of them. Make sure your people know. And as we go through this whole class, I forgot to mention this. We want you guys to ask questions while you're on the page that you want. We'll try to stop, but if we don't, feel free to shoot a question through the chat, and Kaylin will get that out. And then hopefully, if we've got such a mix of people on here. We've got people that have been in the business a long, long time, and we have brand new people. We are absolutely not going to be able to answer every question because we're going to keep it moving. But afterwards, if you have any concerns or questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. So the additional signature page came along with the change in some of the forms. Don't you think that's what brought that about, Ebbie? Because some of the forms didn't allow for enough room?
It was specifically because we were trying to keep from going to another page within the contract, okay? And if we added any more signature lines, that was going to be the issue. So we said, not often do you need the additional ones. So we turned around and said, well, let's just do a page that if it's necessary. Say, for example, you have a trust and there's a bunch of siblings and stuff that need to all sign. That kind of took care of the issue, having it on one form versus always having all these other signature lines. So you would only be using that if there were more lines needed than what's on the actual contract.
You know, I'm glad you said that, because that's we run into lots of LLCs and lots of trusts down here. We see a lot of amendments with that, a lot of name changes with those. And I don't know, Amanda, if you want to add anything to that, but the sooner that you find out, the better. And the more, obviously sometimes name changes are going to be part of the deal, but we definitely have to match what the warranty deed says at the closing. So,
and if
from a
anybody gets
compliance
married and has a spouse that has a marital interest too, then they need it. Even if they're saying, well, I wasn't married when he bought it or whatever, you still need their signature.
Yep. We ready? We'll move on to the next one.
Ready.
Okay. So we're assuming it's a sales process. So we're talking about buyer's exclusive agency contract to start, because we're assuming you're representing a buyer. We're not going to go line by line, but we did highlight some of these. So, one thing that jumps out at us, obviously you have the buyer and the company and all your lines that are left blank so you can fill them out, your time frame, motivating factors. One thing that jumps out that that I see a lot of issue, or not a lot, but I hate it when I see it, is I was working with a buyer. I had them under contract. They bought a property from someone else, or they bought it for sale by owner. Does my contract mean anything? Well, the first thing I'm going to ask is, do you have a buyer's agency? And the second thing I'm going to ask is, can I see it? Because half of them that I see are filled out with a blank in the compensation line. So your lines 21 and 29, 30, and 31 are filled out with a blank. Well, then you have nothing. So if, you know, when we fill those out, we have to fill out what our expectation is. If it's 3.5%, if there's a transaction fee included, has to be there. And then also that 26, 27, 28, you know, I thought for the longest time it was always at closing, and there is obviously an option for only if and on the same date that any additional compensation provided for below is payable. But it doesn't have to be. You could collect a check the day you get in the car, couldn't you, Eb?
Absolutely. And that's where that transaction fee needs to go, is in that area. But before we go any further, and everybody probably already knows this, but when we're going through these forms, does everybody know on the bottom left-hand corner, there's a letter and a number? Okay, so as we're going through, if you can just, you know, if we'll reference what page we're on, in other words, MSC 1080. So what that is it's saying it's a miscellaneous form, but then when you see, say for example, it'll say 1080R, okay, or an N or whatever. So you just know to go to those pages, and if there's an R after it, it means it's a rider to something else, okay? If there's an N, it means it's a notice. So if you'll, as we're going across, if we're saying, okay, it's a notice or something, you'll know to look at the bottom of the page, and that might help you kind of stay with us on this thing. But what I was going to mention, Jeff, is the other lines, 39 through 46, about the protection period. I don't know if everybody's aware, that form even isn't any good if this person, if the time frame runs out and they do a buyer's agency with another agent, you're off, okay? Or if you've shown them a home and then they go get it from somebody else, you need to document to that buyer in writing the address and or the seller's name in order to have any recall with them going back to it. Because otherwise it's your word against somebody else's. So you need to have in writing that you showed them 123 Main Street, the Jones home.
Yeah, that's a huge one, Ebbie. The other thing about buyer's agency, as we go through here, just FYI, the dating of a buyer's agency was probably one of the top 3 dings from our audit. So a buyer's agency always has to be dated at the same, either at the time of the contract date, same date, or the best practice is prior to the day the contract is written. And the reason is you're supposed to be discussing agency and who you're going to represent as early as possible. So yeah, we want to make, what's that?
Before writing that contract.
Yes. Yeah. And she said, you know, here, when I sat down with the auditor, and there were several of us, she said, you know, if it's the same day as the contract, I'm not going to ding you, but really it should be before. Well, a lot of them were the day after, because they figure out that, you know, oh, I got to have a buyer's agency. So that's, from a best practice standpoint, that's one we really want to remember.
And the top line needed to say Remax Lake of the Ozarks. I've seen a couple in the office where they've written their name. Like, I'm not picking on you, Josie. It wasn't you, I swear. But just your name, like Josie Mantle would write her name versus Remax Lake of the Ozarks, you know? You need to stop doing that, Josie. I told you about this. I'm joking. But, you know, that is one thing that I've seen, is a lot of people put their name versus the company.
Good point. Anything else on that?
Let's see.
Second page. We'll flip to the second page then. We highlighted 74 and 79 just to cover you know, conversion to dual agency. So when you're writing a buyer's agency, sometimes it's not thought of that you could convert to a dual agent. So we have seen a few of these that check mark no. You can, you know, if you're going to sell that buyer one of your own listings, you're going to need to convert to a dual agent. And if you're on a team, the way that our designated agency policy reads, if you're on a team, you're going to be a dual agent if you sell one of your own team's listings as well. So most cases you want to check mark yes.
Yeah, that's what I do on all of them, just in case.
Right.
You know, in case they do end up, unless you have somebody that comes in and says, hey, I do not want you to be a dual agent, then for a comfort level, you of course would say no.
Right.
You know.
Same with transaction broker. You know, you want to check yes, but from a company standpoint, we don't like, we allow it, but we don't like transaction brokerage. We believe that we should represent a buyer or seller or be a dual agent rather than a transaction broker. But if you have specific, if you want to add anything on that, Eb, we can. If you have specific questions, don't hesitate to ask that.
I don't have anything to add.
Real quick, guys. I have a statement from Ron. I was under the impression that buyer's exclusive agency was mandatory. In previous class, agents were stating that they don't have one filled out. If I understood their statement correctly, what would be an advantage to not getting an agreement?
Not having a buyer's agency agreement, you mean? Is that what you're asking?
That's correct. If I understood, we had a previous class we were going through talking about buyers and how to proceed with a buyer. And if I understood it correctly, somebody was saying that they don't even get one. Is it mandatory or not? I can't understand why you wouldn't.
But if you're representing the buyer, absolutely you have to have that filled out. I'll tell you, there's been times that I have not. I've written a contract for a buyer and not been a buyer's agent just because something tells me it's not kosher, and I'm concerned if they're telling the truth or whatever, and I don't want the liability. So I've turned around and been a transaction broker just for that fact and didn't do buyer's agent.
Or a seller, you know, or a seller's
seller.
agent if you're writing it on a listing.
Correct.
So I think, Ron, I think if I remember right, or if I'm guessing correctly, I think it has to do with the presentation when you get a buyer's agency sign. And Jeff Winters just added, I have had one buyer who refused to sign one. You don't, you know, if somebody refuses to sign one, we've been through that issue. We don't have that very often, but when we do, we deal with that individually, like, you know, making a note of that. But if what Ebbie said is true, if you're a buyer's agent, you really should always have a buyer's agency. But what we were talking about is how agents present buyer's agency. The goal is to get one of them signed so you have some level of protection as you're working with a buyer. So there's a lot of agents that don't ever get it signed until they write the contract. In fact, I would guess that I don't know what percentage that is, but it's got to be high. So what some of that, where that comment might have came from, is that conversation. When do you get it signed? Jeff just added something and said, I've also had buyers who sign one in another market, i.e. Kansas City, and question the one I'm asking them to sign. Yep. Yeah. And they don't want to obligate themselves to two of them for sure. So you gotta take care of that. And that's why it's important to ask. But Ron, I think it's in everybody's best interest, and everybody can weigh in on this, is that you get very comfortable in the presentation of buyer's agency and how you're going to represent the person and what value that represents to, you know, for them to hire you. And so we'll talk a lot about that in other classes as far as the presentation of it and the ability to get it signed. We talk a lot about Jane Kelly's method of showing people how she works and then asking them. I mean, she pre-warns them that she's going to be asking them. She's going to demonstrate how she works in these first couple days, and then she's going to ask them to commit after that. But it's really the only way we have any contractual agreement with a buyer.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, and I was always getting one, and when I heard that statement, I was thinking, I can't understand why you wouldn't want to get one.
Well, always keep getting one. That's the way to go. That's the best way to protect yourself.
I have a comment on the
Yep.
question about having a buyer's agency signed in Kansas City and coming here. I would tell them, pick up the phone, or I myself would pick up the phone, call that agent and say, will you change your buyer's agency agreement that says only in your market, not here at the lake? Because if you think about it, if you have a buyer's agency agreement, you're supposed to be able to assist them, be knowledgeable in the marketplace, and you can't do that in a different market. So I can't imagine an agent arguing that if you called and said, hey, keep yours in place, but only for your area, and then do one for the lake.
Well, that's a good way to approach that, Ebbie.
So,
Okay, page 3, you see we only got one highlight at the bottom, franchise disclosure. We definitely want to check that. Page 4, I think it's pretty clear. Realtor name again, firm name is RE/MAX Lake of the Ozarks for us. Wherever if there's anybody on here who works anywhere else, it'd be your firm name. 201 and 203. 203 is where the broker has to sign. 201 is the appointment of designated agency, and you guys it'll be your name. For some team, it might be a team leader, team member on top of or in addition, and then that's where I'll sign at the bottom. Any more questions or thoughts about buyer's agency, Ebbie?
not
Or anybody?
on my side.
Okay, first page of the residential sale contract. We are using the one that was redlined. So this is the one that was sent out to you guys in maybe February. It actually contains the year-end changes, just so you can see them again. Ebbie, you want to take us through the first page?
Okay, where it's just talking about the things that are included. Don't assume just because something's on the MLS sheet that it's automatically included, because that's not the case. I typically would go through anything in this top inclusion, exclusion. Oftentimes I'll circle it and then I'll still write it down, but just so that I'm referencing back to what is intended to stay. Propane tanks typically end up being an issue. Well, wait a minute, was the propane tank staying?
Yeah.
Was it rented? Was it owned? Those sort of things. Let's see. The earnest money, that was changed, where before it was just 10 banking days. Now it's 10 effective days. So be sure everybody notices that on the earnest money part. Seller concession, of course, we all know what that is if the seller is paying something towards your closing costs. And really, that's about it.
Well, I'm going to piggyback a couple things. The one thing that we do see happen a lot is that people get not as specific as we could or should have at time of contract or shortly after. And from a negotiation standpoint, people get hung up emotionally on little things, pictures, greenery, I don't care what it is, something silly that should never cause a problem later. So in that included or excluded, you can always add those items. And then but the other thing is, with the included and excluded, lots of times that inventory list should really not be on the first page.
Because of the lender.
Yes, because of the lender. That will cause a real issue. So, but yeah, everything else is
Pretty self-explanatory.
pretty clear
I
on
think.
there.
And then just in that line, you would say, reference inventory list under the included. So then, they know that there should be another item that's spelling out what is or isn't staying.
The other thing that I will say is, no, you're good, Kaylin. The other thing I wanted to add, though, as we go through here, one thing that I hear come up, this is mainly for the newer agents out there, you know, there's lots of blank lines in here. Every blank line has either pre-written date in it or number of days, or it allows you to do it. Lots of times we will see that when you add up those lines, like on this one, for instance, you know, right here on appraisal, it has your number of days. When you add up those lines, sometimes people won't look, and it's actually after closing. So even if you're on the buy side, make sure your days all line out to where you want them to be. Watch that, because we see that a lot. We have check marked the line, I can't read it, 61, 62, and 63 highlighted. Sorry about that, because this is from an audit standpoint, this is a big one. You know, lots of times conventional is checked. Conventional, when it's checked, means that all the blanks have to be filled out. They got us on the audit. That was probably the biggest one on the audit. It's just so easy not to do, because you don't have a specific interest rate yet, or, you know, you don't know your loan amount yet. So, but just fill that out and figure out what type of loan they want, and put something in there, even if it's NA, because they will get us later if we don't. Ebbie, I think the other day you brought up a really good point about this part too, didn't you? About non-conventional versus conventional.
Well, I see it all the time. It happened just the other day. Somebody wrote in there conventional, but then they're going around and they're doing a VA loan, which changes the whole thing. You know, you needed the government writers. The seller needs to know that now they're paying for the termite. You know, there's a lot of things that change within there. But absolutely, if there's a blank line, it's not there just to be able to decide whether or not you want to use it. They expect something in that line. So, you know, even if under like rate, if you don't know, just write in there, you know, still talking with the lender, unsure, whatever. So at least when we do get audited, we can say they had the conversation with the buyer and just didn't know.
Yeah. You can protect.
And you're so right about the dates. I'm not kidding. And I do it myself. I'll not be thinking, I'll say, okay, well, we're going to close in 30 days, but then I've got the inspections for 25 days. Well, you know, you're down to the wire. You can't do these things. Or the resale certificate, same type of thing. You know, we had one the other day that was closing. We didn't even have the resale certificate till the day before closing. So you have to watch all those dates and try to, you know, reference everything around that actual closing to make sure that you're covered.
We actually missed a chat deal. Josie said, do we say see inventory list? And then Susan answered, if the buyer's getting a loan, you do not reference inventory or personal property like boat hoist anywhere on the sale contract, but you send the signed inventory with the offer and a personal property agreement that buyer and seller sign along with the contract docs. The lender does not get the inventory or personal property agreement. And that is so, you know, so it doesn't mess that up. They're real sticklers about that.
And the funny part is the lenders will even tell you, I don't want that on the contract. But really, you are frauding the lender. You know what I mean? So if you turn around and just said, you know, any personal property will transfer outside of the sale, what have you, you know what I mean? By a bill of sale.
We have examples of those bill of sales too that we can share.
Yeah, so any personal property would transfer by that. So, you know, you could always reference it and just say if in fact there's going to be, and then have the inventory list.
Yep.
So, you know, at least you're saying that there could be.
So page 3 had some red lines on it. Ebbie, you want to take us through those?
Okay, where are we here? Hang on. Okay, under, let me get up to the top. I can't see district footage and land. Okay. Property is a part of taxes district. square footage, land or improvements in the presence of registered. So evidently they added land or. Okay. So, I mean, just kind of misreferencing it. So then the other part, they took out septic and waste treatment systems, septic and water waste treatment systems. That is in C. The cost and availability. Okay, equipment. I'm trying to find my way here because I've got the other one in front of me and then the changes.
Oh, no, no
Okay.
problem.
Okay, it says here, gas, exterior drainage, and any appliances included as part of the property. Note the cost, availability, insurance must or should, so they changed to should, also be ascertained during the inspection period. And then that's where they're talking about the flood insurance. What am I missing here after that?
So this section to me, while you're looking at this section to me is probably one of the more confusing ones. And it causes for a lot of conversation. Inspections are so important and they're such a big part of our negotiation that it's very important that we watch our dates, first of all, and that we make sure that, because we're assuming that we're representing a buyer, so make sure that we get everything done within our dates and everything's submitted. It says there's some language in here that's pretty important. You know, you look at line 147 and it says, note, buyer may submit only one inspection notice. It must include all matters unacceptable to buyer and a copy of all relevant inspection reports, specialist reports. Buyer may not object to anything that is not in an inspection report or specialist reports. Well, you all know that that happens, that we see a lot of flexibility with that. We have people try to negotiate after inspection notice, during inspections. We have them try to negotiate all kinds of stuff around inspections. So it's just really good to be familiar with that whole process.
And then the part about waiving that didn't used to be there, that there's a waiving, you know, that you could waive the inspection period and so forth. That'd be somebody who's buying something they already know it's in poor condition. Then the top part where I couldn't read closely enough is talking about getting flood insurance, a quote on that, because what if you wrote a contract and then you find out, my gosh, it's going to be an additional $5,000 a year for flood insurance. So they're saying that the buyer has the right to look into that and get the costs.
So again, make sure your dates are all in line so that you can get the inspection, you can submit it, and you have time to go back and forth. Page 4.
Talking about this, if the buyer is asking for a home warranty, is the seller already offering it, what they'll pay. Say, for example, if the seller already has one in place that they took out when they listed it, that warranty would still be good for a year after closing for the buyer, but you would want to know. And then another thing that we had an issue with is it says that the buyer is the one who chooses it. Before, that didn't used to clarify. It would just say a home warranty would be offered. So you need to remember, we had somebody who was waiting for us to order the home warranty, and we said no, it was the buyer was going to choose it, and we were paying up too. So that was one personal thing that we've had a mess up on.
This can we go back real quick just for a second? This isn't redlined, but it's comes up a lot. Earnest money. So I'm just going to give you my 2 cents on earnest money. You know, a $5,000 is put down on a contract. The contract goes away. What the earnest money has been put up and is being held by a title company. What happens with earnest money? Earnest money will not be released by a title company without a mutual release signed by both parties. If they are in disagreement about why one of them got out or one of them had the right to get out or not, lots of times that earnest money becomes an issue. So if you're representing a buyer, I think it's good to talk a little bit about earnest money as they plan what they're going to put down. I like a lot of earnest money. I mean, I want my buyers the buyers that I represent to be very serious about their offers and know exactly what they're getting into. At the same time, you need to talk about what happens if a deal goes bad and how earnest money is handled. Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
Well, I've heard before, you know, agents will say, well, don't worry about it. Go ahead and put down 5,000, 10,000. You'll get it back if you don't pass the inspections or what have you. You still need to remember that seller can still tie it up.
Yeah.
You know, so regardless of if there is an out, you still have to get that signed. So,
Right.
I mean, it could be in limbo for a while till they decided, hey, yeah, I'm fine with your decision why you were backing out.
And the way around that might be a smaller amount of earnest money until the inspections are resolved. Yeah. Okay. Seller's disclosure statement. Eb, I'm sorry, you want to take us through this one?
Where are you right now?
Page
Seller's
6.
disclosure. Okay, just saying whether or not they're, oh, wait a minute, let's go back, disposition. Loss or condemnation, can I touch on that for a second?
Yeah.
Okay. What that's referring to, let's just say, for example, you've written an offer on a house that's $100,000, okay? They've accepted $100,000. The house is insured for $200,000. Follow me? Tornado comes through. Buyer says, hey, I don't care that the house is gone. I'm still buying it. The buyer gets the insurance money. See what I'm saying? Now, of course, that couldn't happen if they were getting a loan, but if they're paying cash and something like that happens, they have the opportunity to say, I'm still buying it and I'm collecting the insurance. So anyways, just wanted to touch base on that. So,
And Ebbie, isn't that all part of equitable title?
that I don't know.
Well, so basically, I think it does relate. I mean, we're getting pretty deep, but basically when you have a signed contract and I'm buying Ebbie's property and we've negotiated and signed it, as long as I uphold everything I have to uphold, I have equitable title in that property. So I think that all comes into play once you're locked into a contract. But that's it's interesting. We do see scenarios that get pretty deep.
Yeah, that makes sense, you know, with saying the equitable title. I never thought of it that way, but that is correct.
Okay.
So seller's disclosure, just saying whether or not the seller is providing a disclosure. Has the buyer already signed it, or is there even not going to be one? A lot of times people think it's mandatory to have a seller's disclosure, but it is not required. So if the seller's not comfortable, maybe they don't feel they know enough information, they're not required to fill it out.
Watch your dates on your contract too with that. You might want to ask for an updated seller's disclosure. If you find one that's way out of date or you think there's been changes made. We've had that come up quite a bit. They change the walkthroughs, huh?
Yeah, the buyer can have a walkthrough. It's saying about, you know, each have the right walk through the property. It's not intended to do another inspection. It's to make sure that it's in the same condition as when you wrote the offer, is the whole intent behind that. Let's see, where are we? Walkthrough notice may be used. So they're referencing again a miscellaneous form saying I can't see the number, 2600N, meaning notice. So you would use that one. And then a waiver of inspection does not waive the right of a walkthrough, saying they can still do the walkthrough, okay? And I noticed a lot of title companies have a form that says that they did conduct a walkthrough, which, you know, lessens the liability of the seller in that sense. Okay.
There is really almost a form for everything anymore. We have got a long way to go, so we're going to keep going here. So riders, this is for your attachments. It's what Ebbie was referring to earlier, government rider, backup, rider, backup contract. Boy, we're dealing with that a lot lately, so we plug some of those in later.
And reference in that area where it says other, any riders that you have that are attached to that contract need to be in that area, because if somebody else picks up this contract, they need to know what else to be looking for. Okay, so that eliminates the seller saying, you know, I didn't know that there was a rider about that you needed to sell your house. But if it's there, there's no question whether or not they were informed. So I would say that's one thing you really, really need to make sure that those boxes, you know, the ones that they already put in are checked, or hand write in the other ones that you've attached to it.
We didn't highlight it, but that licensee personal interest, you know, if you're selling to anyone who has a license, that needs to be disclosed. If you're buying anything yourself, that needs to be disclosed. By the way, if you're buying something yourself and you're a licensed agent, you need a home inspection to engage your E&O. So if you're buying or selling a property, you want to have a home inspection as part of that, because that is some of the small print and E&O policy when it comes to selling or buying your own property.
Jeff, wasn't there something, if you were a seller, you had to provide a home warranty? Was there something?
Yeah, if you're selling your own property,
You have to give the home warranty to the buyer.
I'm sorry, Lois said home inspection or home warranty. It's actually home warranty.
And then the source of brokerage, that was one that came up during the audit.
1,000
because of
times.
getting the transaction fee.
Yes.
So if you're collecting a transaction fee as the buyer or seller, whatever, you need to check the box that you are also getting compensated. Okay, and then licensee assisting, and we kind of touched on that already. You know, if it's somebody on your team, you're a dual agent. If you're a transaction broker, buyers limited, sellers, and then always check the bottom box saying designated agent. One thing that I see happen a lot too is we're supposed to fill out the other agent's side. So say, for example, you're filling this out and you're representing the buyer. You need to fill out the seller's side, what the company is, what their license number is, and the agent's license. I would say 99% of the time that isn't done. The other offices are not filling that in, but it is a requirement.
Abby, you got anything on this?
Franchise disclosure, signature needed additional. Then it's saying if you need that additional page, which we just got. Then, you know, if it's say a trust or anything like that, they need to fill that out as, you know, as who the trust is, or a corporate, whatever, that's buying it. So that has a separate line there. Deadline for acceptance. You're probably going to have a difference of opinion on this, but it was an attorney had this comment, and I thought, my God, it makes so much sense. Do I follow it? No, I still change and say time frame for acceptance. Like say, for example, it said the offer expires at noon on the 10th, okay? And then it ended up being 2 o'clock in the afternoon when they signed. Well, I would always just cross it off, and still do, cross it off and say, you know, all parties agree that it's now 2 o'clock. Well, the one class I went to with the attorney, he said, and who are you to be able to resurrect something? I mean, do you think you're God? You know, if something's dead, it's dead. So it was really funny because I knew everybody in the class was like, holy crap, where did this come from? But it is true from an attorney standpoint. So I've often wondered, even though I still do it, I've often wondered if I ended up in arbitration and the attorney was arguing that fact, it would be a tough fight, because they said you can't resurrect something that has already died. You have to come in with a new contract. I think you'll agree, Jeff.
Yeah.
Most of us just changed it.
Oh yeah. Jeff Winters just said, just an FYI, if you use Transaction Desk to write up a contract, it'll pull license info and populate in the proper fields. That is a neat feature, that autofill.
Wow.
Yeah,
Well,
that
I didn't know.
autofill is really cool.
Yeah, good.
So that's the last page of the sales contract. Should we keep going? I know we're very tight on time.
Well, I
Okay.
have to make a comment,
Okay.
because Paula's gonna be mad if I don't. Do you remember when Mel did her videos, okay? She would say, there were a couple times where Mel said, and then when I had questions and I don't want to answer whatever, I'm trying to get the sellers to think it over, and she picks up her Krantz Yeti thing, you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Her cup.
Yeah.
Well, this is how I handle if somebody has questions. All right. So I'm ready for any questions. Mel has her cup. I have my glass of wine here. So we're good.
That's awesome, Ebbie.
It's all in
Hey.
how you handle the stress.
Hey, you might need that to get through a forms class for sure. Okay,
right.
counter offer. You know, we know we'll take who starts it. I just wanted to highlight 6, 7, and 8 because believe it or not, they changed it years ago. So some of us that are old in this business, older veterans in this business, I would call us. Any terms agreed to in a previous counteroffer must be included in this counteroffer, along with any new proposed changes. Only the terms contained in this counteroffer, together with the remaining unchanged terms of the contract, including any addenda or riders attached thereto, constitute the new offer. So it has to be carried forward. It can't be in counteroffer 1, and then when you counteroffer in counteroffer 2, if it's not moved with it, it doesn't count. So that wasn't always the same. So we wanted to highlight that again. Time
Correct,
for
because
accept.
you should be able to pick up that last counter
Yep.
and know exactly.
Yeah.
You should be able to, if you had 3 counteroffers before, you should be able to throw those in the trash. Just have counter number 4 and know what everybody agreed to. Absolutely.
It makes sense. It's just that I feel like changing over the years has made it confusing. I have to go back and reread it every time somebody asks about it.
Well, I like that they added where it says, you know, other change, and then they reference the section, the line, the writer. To me, that made it so much easier.
Got more
You know,
specific.
to know exactly where you're going to. Okay.
Amanda wanted to make sure that we pointed out there's a lot of little, sometimes it's you know, we're getting close to getting an offer accepted, and 37, 38, and 39. Well, first of all, time for acceptance gets confusing in between orders as it goes. So time for acceptance is really important because if it's not timed right, you're dead. So it needs to be within, all the signatures need to be within time and date. You know, if they sign on the same day as the expiration, they need to time it if it's timed up top. So make sure those little details on the end are covered because that's where they're going to get us. That's where they got us a lot.
Also at the top of the page too, like checking the appropriate seller or buyer box as well.
Yeah, seems silly, but it's not silly in the MREC's opinion. Amendment, we added an amendment. Everybody uses amendments. We use them to change anything and everything that we need to change throughout the process. We need to change the closing date or the possession, any of the contingencies. Anything else on that, Eb?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking to see because I had made notes previously. No, I don't see. I think it's pretty self-explanatory.
It is.
Huh?
Yeah, it is.
I don't see.
Well, if
just
questions
making
come
sure
up,
you change the possession and the closing, you know, because if you left it the other way, possession would still be what you had initially, and you're closing a different day. So, you know, you would just want to make sure you didn't miss that line.
that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't see.
Well, let's
It's
keep
pretty simple.
moving. Addendum A, everybody just loves this. This is everyone's favorite form. I know that. I'm glad that nobody can throw anything, that I'm not in the same room. It's kind of neat. Just to give you an idea why Addendum A came about and how it came about, it wasn't to make everyone's life more painful. The reason it came about is because last minute surprises that involved Ameren UE, permits, boat docks, became really, really damaging to deals. We had several deals come up where by the time someone realized that the permit in place was not the right permit, the dock that was sitting there was not permitted, the seawall was not permitted, you couldn't get it done. Also, we had people that said, you were my buyer's agent. Why did you not tell me that boat dock electrical was not updated? And by the way, boat dock electrical requirements, as most of you on here know, change about every time we turn around. So we didn't want any of the agents getting into a pickle. We kind of wanted to force conversation up front. Right up front, if you're buying a residential lakefront property, these things need to be talked about. And we need to put the seller on the hook to provide the permits and documentation that's needed. Do you agree with the way I'm laying that out, Eb?
Absolutely. This is off the subject, but I just want to mention it before I forget. When I write a contract, I always state the boat dock currently in place, because about 20 years ago, seller said, you asked for a boat dock. I'll have a boat dock there. I mean, it was almost a major nightmare. So now I say the boat dock that's currently in place, because they could pull out that dock, put another one in, and say, all you asked for was a dock. You know what I'm saying? So, and then oftentimes, on behalf of the sellers, a lot of times, years ago, people weren't doing the inspections like they are now, making sure that they're in their lot lines. So I don't think they're deceiving us when they say, oh, I have everything. You know, it's correct. It's in my lot lines. And then, you know, without this, you end up at the 11th hour finding out, no, it's encroaching or what have you. So to me, although I'm with you, I hate dealing with it also, but it really lets everybody sleep better at night, the agents, the buyer, and the seller, to know up front what's going to be expected.
So we'll address individual questions on that if you have them. We just don't want anybody to get surprised. Lots of agents are afraid to ask the questions up front. But the truth of it is, when you get one of those bad surprises right before closing, you'll wish you asked the question. So that's why we do that. I don't think we need to go over this inspection notice because we're running out of time, because we want to hit some of the forms that are part of the process that aren't well known. It's pretty self-explanatory. You just have to have an inspection notice, and how it goes on to how. Go back one, please. The first part, go back one more.
Sorry.
First part of the inspection notice is obviously where you put what the request is, or if they are terminating the contract down here on the bottom.
Correct.
The second part is how the seller's going to respond. Seller's response. And then when it goes on and the buyers have to respond again, buyers reply to seller's response. So they have that in that form. And then the next one is the continuation. And this happens often as well. We just wanted you to see that there's a form for that when that gets continued. Everything has to stay in date. There is a form for contingency for the sale of buyer's existing property. I remember back in the olden days when we would write, this offers contingent upon the seller's successful sale of their home listed at 1, 2, 3. We'd write it all in special agreements. They're trying to make sure we know we're not attorneys, and they're trying to get a form for everything, and I love it. So there's a form for that, and then there's a form. The next one is for the Oh, well, this one, there is, if you go back one, there is actually a notice of the removal of a kick out. Well, this isn't the kick out. I'm sorry. This is contingency for sale of buyer's existing property. I got you. I think we might have the kick out on there later. This one is if the buyer's financing falls through, but they can't get information from their lender. This is a form for that, that the buyers can fill out and have notarized so that you can provide that so you have some backup to get that earnest money released. Now, what Ebbie said earlier is really important. Even when providing this, the seller might get stern and not sign a mutual release. I've had that happen, but at least they're trying to put something in writing that, you know, when the seller won't provide, or the mortgage company or bank won't provide a letter, the buyer can do it themselves. Anything to add on that?
I was going to say I'd had some notes here. One thing I think a lot of people question is, say, for example, the seller does have their house under contract and you're in backup position, okay? It's supposed to close November 1st. I'm talking about the original contract. It's supposed to close November 1st. And then the seller decides, I'm going to extend it another week, another month, what have you. The seller has that right per the contract. They can revise that original contract even though you're in backup position. You know, a lot of people think, hey, no, I've got a contract. They didn't close. It's now mine. That's not the case. They can still argue the fact, not argue the fact, but change the fact of what they had agreed to originally. And then the other thing is understand, once those contingencies are removed and, you know, the kick out clause, whatever, that's when your time frame starts, getting your inspections, getting your title work and everything. The clock doesn't start ticking till they notify you that you're in position.
And these two forms are part of that.
Yes.
And those are good forms. So existing property sale kick out notice. So there it is. You write a contract on a house, but your people have to sell theirs first. So there's a form for that. You know, it makes it a lot easier than writing it out like we used to. You just basically fill it out, and it does allow for you to say whether it's under contract or they're not. You know, they're not going to get it done. What should we add on that? I mean, make sure if you're in a backup position, you have to have this. Especially if you're on the listing side, if you're playing with multiple offers and one of them wants to write a backup, that backup really has to be a backup. Don't accept it without that backup.
Or you've sold that house twice.
Yeah. Hey, that just happened to us not long ago. We had an agent get into that. Thankfully, it wasn't, you know, the problem wasn't on our agent's end. It was on the other one, but it was bad. You know, that was not good.
If I can go back to the mutual release, make sure everything, if the buyers ordered any inspections, survey, anything, make sure you've got receipts that those are paid for before you release any money back to the buyer.
One thing that I was going to say too, if you are a new agent and maybe not familiar with kickout, you need these two forms and then also this next one, the contract writer, to do a successful kickout process. Correct, Jeff?
You need these two forms to what?
These two forms and then this next one to do the successful kickout process, correct? You need all three forms.
Yes. I have to respond slowly because I'm never exactly sure. You're right. Bruce, you're the freshest on this one. Would you do this yesterday?
A couple days ago.
Pretty new.
Yeah.
And they reference back to one another. Like the one says, seller waives this contingency. Then you have to see line 12 on the rider, the 2023 rider, because that's saying about the seller has the elects to waive the contingency without a written release. So one references back to the other, I think is what you're saying.
Yes, ma'am.
We are almost out of time, but we've only got like one more form. This is an appraisal notice, which is kind of interesting. It's a newer form. You know, these appraisals that come back short, or hopefully we don't deal with that much, but sometimes we get into areas where we're pushing the price in the market and we have appraisals that come back short. So this is a form that allows for notice to be given and the seller to respond. So it's basically opens it up to negotiation. This only applies if you have that appraisal box or financing. If you put cash and you get one down and you don't have, I mean, you could still try to negotiate it, I guess, but it wouldn't apply. Don't you agree with that,
It
Em?
won't hold up because you didn't make it subject to an appraisal.
Right.
And then they can't get the loan without the appraisal, but still, regardless, you need to check that box because they can say, hey, I got the loan,
Right.
just the house didn't qualify. More often than not, if the appraisal doesn't come in and then the seller says, well, I'm going to get my own appraisal, most banks are going to require 3 appraisals. You can't say this was the buyer's, this was the seller's. Usually they're going to say, I want a third opinion so they can, nobody's partial on one side or the other.
I think that if you asked around, that's it's happening a considerable amount of times right now because we're pushing price and
Right.
appraisals are struggling to get comps at what the properties are bringing right now. So you need to make sure that that's part of the conversation you have with the buyer before you get to this point. If you don't talk about it ahead of time and then the buyer gets an appraisal that comes out short, the buyer's going to not understand why that is, and they're going to it's going to be more of a shock. So if you talk about that a little bit in the beginning, it's not so much of a shock. So make that part of your conversation. Guys, we ran through our time quickly. We're going to try to do this every quarter and break it down. So sales, and then one on listings, and then maybe one on miscellaneous, so we can try to stay up on these changes. We sure appreciate all of you. Thank you, Ebbie.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Does anybody have any quick questions? Yes, Lori, I see you raising your hand.
Not Lori, anybody but Lori.
I just have a few questions. Okay, real quick, back to the inspection section now that they've added in the insurance cost. So if there's a loan contingency, and you know, typically as part of a loan commitment, they have to have insurance. So should we be concerned if there is an issue with flood or with any insurance and it's past our inspection period?
I believe there's verbiage in the sales contract with respect to insurance now.
Okay.
So we would have to, I'll go back, I can go back and look at that, but I think, hang on, one more maybe. Where is it? Let's see. I'm looking, Lori.
Oh,
Okay.
right there.
Right?
To me,
No.
that would fall under the lender more so than an inspection, because it's a lender that would be requiring the flood insurance.
Right.
And then, you know, it's going to throw off the ratios, having that extra
Right.
cost of the insurance.
Right. But I mean, the property has to be insurable now.
Correct.
Okay.
And those records are, so I mean, I think that would be a pretty good argument.
I just didn't know if it was the buyer's choice not to pay for the flood insurance, meaning it was too costly and we're past that inspection period. Does it still fall under the loan?
Well, Lori,
it
on the
disclosed?
seller's disclosure, it says whether or not they have flood insurance.
Well,
So
yeah.
if that were checked, you'd automatically say, hey, wait a minute, you've got flood insurance, what are you paying? And if it wasn't checked, I think you would have the right to go back and say, hey, wait a minute, you told me it wasn't requiring it, it is. So I think you'd have
Okay.
a way out there too.
Okay. All right. And then just another question. I want to make sure I'm correct with regards to seller's disclosures. Do seller's disclosures have to be dated in line with what's checked under section, whatever that is, section 15? Meaning, if it's marked that they have the seller's disclosures, does it have to be dated with the contract date?
Two answers on that. One, best practices, we'd like all the dates to be in line, but the auditor specifically said a seller's disclosure is filled out by the seller, and you can't even force a seller to fill out a seller's disclosure. So I think there's some leeway with respect to that. I think that's why they allowed the seller to check mark on the seller's disclosure that they weren't going to disclose anything.
Okay.
In an attempt to get either a disclosure or a refusal of disclosure. What do you think about that, Em?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand what you're saying,
I mean, the
are
buyer.
you talking about where it says the seller will supply it within 3 days or something?
No,
or you mean just originally the disclosure itself?
Specifically, I was asking about the buyer's date on their signature, the buyer's signature date.
Well, to me, if the buyer says the seller's to supply it in 3 days, we know it's not going to be signed at the same time as the offer.
Right.
Nowhere on there does it say that the buyer is going to sign it on that 3rd day or anything. Okay.
Okay.
But I mean.
So even if A is checked, it does not, that the buyer's date doesn't have to be in line with the offer and or contract date?
Well, what are you going to use? I mean,
Yeah, I've never had that question.
I haven't either. I think you better have it signed before your inspections are over, though.
Right. I just didn't know if that was an audit,
No, I don't think
Wait,
so.
Okay.
Lori, it says right there, buyer confirms that before signing this offer to purchase, buyer received the seller's disclosure for the property. So to me, you've already acknowledged that you've gotten it. So whether you signed it or not, you've just checked that box saying you've reviewed it. So to me, it's one and the same.
As a buyer's agent, I just think you want to push them to review it and sign it so that you've done your part to get them to see what the sellers are disclosing.
Right. Okay. But again, that sounds like it's a best practice. It's not an audit, whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
And then one more quick question. I know with regards to the other co-op agent filling out the brokerage section, is it an audit ding if somebody from another office doesn't capitalize RE/MAX? That's happened a lot. No big deal?
Absolutely not. That's a corporate deal. We can't control that.
Okay.
We can only control our own, and we want to write it as corporate wants us to write it. Like any other franchise would like it, but no, no, not on the other end.
They wouldn't have any idea that it's a requirement on our side,
Okay. And just one more question, I promise, this is my last one.
Hey.
Lori, we love questions.
Okay, this is regarding Addendum A. I just want to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. Okay, and it's under the Ameren permits section, where the date is 5 days for buyer's review of the permits that were provided. Is that 5 days after receipt, or are we counting 5 days after effective contract date?
Well, that would be.
I would say, because the top part is saying seller will provide it within X amount of days.
That would be after receipt.
And then buyer has those amount of days to review it.
And we've had so much conversation about the date section. The bottom line is, have the conversation. Get it out there. Put a safe amount of date based upon your contract term in there to make them give it to you and to get it out on the table. So.
And I knew this wasn't an audit thing, but I've always done it 5 days after receipt. Somebody mentioned to me, well, that doesn't say that. Well, and I guess it really doesn't. But anyway, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done. No more questions.
We do love your questions, Lori.
Marge, do you have a question?
I just personally hate it because you're smarter than I am. Hey,
Margie, I can't hear you.
I think, why don't we do this? Why don't we follow up after? Because I have to bail off here because we're almost 15 after. So thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks,
I'm gonna
guys.
jump off.
Bye.
Take care.